Welcome to today's Leadership Live for IT managers in law firms, and we're going to look at how to handle difficult conversations and not avoid them. So, in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to share some practical tips that you can use this week to handle difficult conversations. In my experience, most managers don't avoid difficult conversations because they don't care. They avoid them because in fact they do care about the relationship and they don't want to get it wrong, or they don't want to upset the person, or they kind of hope that the issue will just go away. But the conversations we avoid rarely just go away on their own, and in fact what we typically find is they get harder because you've been putting it off. So one of my coaching clients, head of IT for a big law firm, had been putting off a difficult conversation with one of his service desk analysts. And every Monday morning, they had this audio-visual checklist that this analyst was supposed to do every day. But every every Monday, sorry, every week, it wasn't getting done, or it's getting done but much later in the day. And my client was getting just so frustrated. And he said, he's got the checklist. He knows it needs to be done on a Monday morning. Why isn't he just doing it? And what was happening as a result is that the partners were calling him, the head of IT, directly because the meeting room equipment wasn't working or they couldn't find the instructions. So rather than assuming why the analyst wasn't doing it, we talked about how he could approach that conversation with curiosity and using coaching style questions. So instead of asking, why aren't you doing this, for God's sakes, I've told you 100 times, he started by trying to understand what was happening. And actually, it turned out that the analyst wasn't trying to avoid the task. It's just that he was prioritizing what he believed were the more urgent service desk tickets that had come in. Nobody had ever explained to him why the audiovisual checklist mattered. He hadn't made that connection that if the equipment wasn't working or if the instructions weren't there and the lawyer didn't know how to use the equipment, it reflected badly on the lawyer in front of the client. And ultimately, that reflects badly on the reputation of the firm. So once he understood the impact of this seemingly very simple task and very admin-y task almost, everything changed. Once he had that connection, the checklist became the first thing he did every Monday morning. And in fact, he took pride in getting it done. So the difficult conversation there wasn't about telling someone off, it was very much about creating that understanding. So if we haven't met before, I'm Sherry Bevan. I'm a leadership consultant and team performance coach, and I help IT managers become more confident leaders and build high performing teams. And I work in particular with IT managers in law firms. And this is part of my Leadership Live summer series. And today we're looking at how to handle some of those difficult conversations and why you shouldn't avoid them. So, those conversations, if you just keep ignoring it, they don't disappear. And in fact, typically what happens, it becomes a bigger and bigger issue. You start to dread the conversation even more. It kind of snowballs or mushrooms in the significance of that conversation. And what we see as well is that, those small frustrations start to become resentment. And if it's a performance issue, sometimes that becomes a habit. Misunderstandings can become conflict situations, not just for you and the person you're avoiding the conversation with, but the team morale overall suffers. So if you've got someone that keeps coming in late, for example, and everybody thinks you're ignoring it, that sets the culture. The culture of your team is the behavior that's tolerated. And people start to think, well, if he's not saying anything to Fred, why should I bother coming in on time? Why should I put myself out and do a good job? And honestly, everyone else does notice, even if you think they don't. They might not say anything, but over time, it has a big impact on the overall team culture and behavior. So before I jump into sharing some practical things that you can do, I invite you to take a moment to reflect on a difficult conversation that you've had or one that you've avoided. So I want you to think about what made it difficult to have that conversation. Was it the fear of upsetting someone? Were you worried about damaging the relationship? Is it that you didn't know what to say? Or perhaps you just hoped that the problem would go away? So, the first idea or the first tip that I've got for you is don't wait until frustration builds. So, deal with it now. Often we think, I'll give it another week, it'll probably sort itself out, or, well, it's not that serious. But usually it doesn't improve. And as I've already shared, the behavior that you tolerate, that sets the culture, that sets the tone, that sets the performance for the whole of the team. And when you delay things, it rarely makes the conversation easier. If anything, it makes it harder. And then what happens sometimes is that the frustration will burst out of you or burst out of someone else unexpectedly at just the wrong moment. And you'll say things that in the heat of the moment, we sometimes say things we didn't really mean or that were perhaps not kind. So don't wait until the frustration builds. If you've been thinking about having that conversation for more than a week, it's time to do it. You know, it's what's that expression? Be cruel to be kind. So by not having the conversation, you're dragging things out. And the last thing you want is in like 2 months' time and you bring it up at performance or appraisal time and the person will say, why on earth didn't you say something before? So um, just deal with it. Don't let it build. Don't wait. So the second thing I encourage you to do is to be curious first. So I mentioned about that conversation with that head of IT in the law firm. You know, he was thinking this analyst just couldn't be bothered or that this analyst was not getting to work on time or was being lazy. But in fact, the analyst thought he was doing a good thing because he was dealing with the urgent service desk tickets, not realizing he hadn't made that connection between the audio-visual checklist and all the equipment being in the right place and all switched on and the instructions being in the right place. He hadn't connected that with the client, the service to the client and the reputation of the firm. So don't start with judgment, start with curiosity. And because sometimes when we've gotten frustrated about something, we might start with, oh, you've got a bad attitude or you're always late. And of course, as soon as you say something like that, it encourages the other person to be defensive. And that's never a good place to start a conversation. So be curious first. So, for example, you might say, I've noticed something and I'd like to understand what's going on. So you can use questions like, help me understand what's going on here, or can you talk me through, or what's your perspective, or how does it look from your point of view? And that means by asking those kind of coaching, open questions, people will be much less defensive and you're much more likely to get to the underlying issue or problem or perspective, and that will help you and the person to come up with a good solution. And then the last of these practical ideas I've got for you today is to focus on the behavior, not on the person. So rather than saying to somebody, you're so unreliable, think about what was that behavior? What happened as a result? What were the consequences? What was the impact? So rather than you're so unreliable, instead you might say, I've noticed over the last 3 weeks that you've missed 2 deadlines, or I've noticed that last month you weren't at the team meeting on time. So that's about focusing on the behavior and the consequences, not on the person and not on their identity. Because behavior can change. Whereas if you comment on their identity, that feels like an attack. And that's a really important distinction. You want to focus on what's happening rather than why you think it's happening, because there might be another underlying issue. I remember another example of somebody who was, complaining that this particular person kept arriving late on, usually on Mondays and Tuesdays. And when they had the conversation with that person, it turned out that this person had overnight taken on carer responsibilities for their elderly mother, and that they were having to go to their mother's flat first because she'd had a fall, and it meant that they were always, catching a different train than usual, or coming in from a different train station, and it just meant that they were coming in a few minutes late. And yes, you could think, well, why didn't they come and speak to me? But the research I've done on carer responsibilities, most people don't let work know because they don't want their work to think, oh, that means you're going to be an unreliable person. So having that conversation and focusing on the behavior, not the person, is so important. So those are the three things. We've talked about what happens when we avoid those difficult conversations. So it affects team morale, it affects team performance, changes the culture, you get resentment and conflict potentially build up. And then the three tips or the three ideas that I gave you was to don't wait until you get to the frustration point when frustrations boil over. Be curious first. So go into that conversation wanting to understand from their point of view. And then the third thing was to focus on the behavior and the consequences, not on the person or their identity. So in these leadership lives, what I always like to offer to you is a challenge for the week. And so my challenge for you this week is, I want you to think of a conversation that you've been putting off. And my challenge to you is, before Friday, I want you to put it in the diary. I want you to schedule it, not just talk about it, but put it in the diary. I don't just mean have it, if you can have it before Friday, great, but make sure it's in the diary, get it scheduled, because once it's in the diary, you're much more likely to do it. Now, handling difficult conversations is a huge topic, and there's no way I can cover everything in sort of 15, 20 minutes. And actually, for my Leadership Development Day for IT managers, I've created a private podcast on exactly this topic. And so everybody that attends that Leadership Development Day in October will get access to this private podcast. But if you think that would be useful for you, it goes into handling difficult conversations with competence in much more detail. It gives you ideas on how to prepare for that meeting, what to do during the meeting, how to start the meeting, and what to do after the conversation as well. It's 6 episodes, bite size, so no more than 5 minutes. I think 1 or 2 of them might be just over 5 minutes, but I go much deeper into the mindset, the structure, and practical techniques. So if you'd like access to that, just drop me a LinkedIn message with the word podcast, and I'll happily send it over to you. And if you're looking for other leadership and team performance insights, 3 ways you can do that with me: my Team Talk newsletter on LinkedIn, subscribe to that, my Team Talk podcast, and every couple of months I run the Team Culture Club, which is an online peer session where we take current team culture or team performance or leadership challenges and discuss them together as a group. So if you're familiar with the lean coffee format, it works like that. So we come together, it's quite a small group, no more than 10 people at the most, and everybody brings a current sticky situation or a problem or a challenge that's bothering them, and then we write all of those down, we vote on which one to talk about first, and then we usually get through 2 or 3 topics every session. So Team Culture Club, that's for you if you want to get others' ideas and experiences on how to tackle culture issues. And then just finally, if you want to explore how we can work together so that you feel more confident as a leader and your team perform more effectively, you can book a call with me today, sherrybevan.co.uk/call. I hope you've enjoyed this session today, and I'll be back next week. And next week, I'm going to look at some of the mistakes that new IT managers make and how to avoid them. Speak to you then.